This talk is called How Women's Clubs Lost Their Moral Authority. It's a subject that you would have to dig really, really far if you wanted to find out about it, because it's been left out of the textbooks, like many of the interesting parts of women's history. Many parts of women's history are unknown, even to the scholars of it, I would say. Now, when you talk about women's right to vote and the history of it, people like to say that it was a battle of men on one side, women on the other side, the women supposedly in favor and the men against. It's not really true. Sure, lawmakers often denied women the right to vote, but as this slide shows, it was a debate between two groups of women. So these lawmakers, you might condemn them, you might be inclined to condemn them, but at the same time they were being influenced by women who petitioned against their own right to vote. The lawmakers were influenced by their own wives and mothers and sisters also, who saw some reasons why it would be better if women had some other kind of influence other than partisan political influence. I saw a bumper sticker recently that I like. It said, "What would grandma do?" And I like that because it summarizes the point that I'm going to make here. I've often had a similar thought that it would be nice if, besides our lawmakers, we had some other group of people with some kind of authority. Perhaps grandmothers, perhaps college students, perhaps teachers. There are all kinds of groups who could potentially have some kind of authority and that we would trust because we would know that they're acting in the public interest, not in their own interest. And that is a part of history that has been forgotten. There was a huge phenomenon of women's clubs in the United States. It began around 1890, continued to about 1920, and then they lost their influence after that. 1920 was the year women got the vote. Clubs became an enormous phenomenon. They started off often like the book clubs of today, or maybe a woman took a trip and she'd report about my trip to France, or she'd go research Greek art or something like that, some subject or other. But anyway, it was said that around 1910 and so on, there was hardly a village in America that was so small that it didn't have a women's club, or possibly two. Here's a picture of club women in Washington, D.C. And as time went on, the clubs became more influential. They started influencing politicians, not in partisan ways, but if women wanted something done, they would petition legislators. They would just go talk to lawmakers. In many, many towns across America, it was women's clubs who were responsible for getting the schools built, new parks, safe water supply, and on, this sort of thing. And if women's clubs endorsed some law, everyone understood that they were doing it for the public good. Politicians at that time had a bad reputation. And it was said in the late 1800s, for example, that politics was such a corrupt business that any man that entered it would lose his integrity. The pressures were so great. For example, pursuing that point for a moment, at that time they didn't have civil service exams. So let's say the Republicans get voted in. Well, if you're a Democrat and you're working for the government, there's about a 50-50 chance you'd lose your job. And so there were these tremendous economic pressures. Of course, some of the pressures we still have today, lobbying and so on, campaign finance, but those patronage jobs were an additional issue. In California, the women's clubs accomplished some wonderful things. They were responsible for the creation of the first state park, Big Basin State Park. It's a wonderful, huge park. They were responsible for the creation of the music department at UC Berkeley. In Hawaii, women's clubs succeeded in getting billboards banned. I wouldn't mind if that had happened in more places as well. But the point is, women's clubs had influence and they used it in constructive ways. Here's the logo of the General Federation of Women's Clubs: unity in diversity. There was an understanding that women of all political beliefs could work together and accomplish good things. The women's clubs, most of them, did not allow partisan politics to become part of their activities because they understood there was a great strength that came from women uniting and saying, we have moral authority here. It's something that's been lost. As a matter of fact, in our society, I'm not sure who you could say has moral authority. It's changed even over my lifetime. And they understood that this authority became, they understood that they had this authority because they were non-partisan. And now that didn't mean they didn't get involved in politics. They did get involved in politics, but in non-partisan ways. They would back candidates, they would circulate petitions, they would support laws, they would lobby, but always in a non-partisan way. So this is why the women's clubs did not support their own right to vote. They saw there was a moral advantage, a practical advantage, and they had more influence if they stayed out of partisan politics. The reason I think this is important is because if you look in history textbooks, they'll tell you, oh, women demanded the vote and those pig-headed male lawmakers slammed the door in their faces and wouldn't give them the vote. And I object to that because it's not accurate. Here are some facts about the women's suffrage movement that are hard to find. More women organized against their own right to vote than in favor of it. Women's right to vote was never supported by a majority of women. The whole time, 1848 to 1920, it was never backed by a majority of women. As a matter of fact, the final women's suffrage leader was Carrie Chapman Catt. And just before the final victory, a lawmaker said, all right, why don't we put this to a referendum of women? Let's have women vote on whether women should have the right to vote. Carrie Chapman Catt objected to that. She said, no, we do not want women to vote on whether they should have the right to vote. It's extremely ironic. And she gave 3 reasons. She said, it was never demanded of men, it serves no useful purpose, and men were never asked to do such a thing. But it still shows you that women did not back the suffragists, even after 72 years of campaigning. It's a remarkable thing. I published an academic article which you can easily find online. Here's the title, Never a Fight of Woman Against Man: What Textbooks Don't Say About Women's Suffrage. And the problem with the dominant viewpoint about suffrage history and women's history in general is it adopts a victim point of view. Now, there is a place for that in the world where it's appropriate. That's one way to get power, is pointing out how women have been victims in some cases. So I'm not totally against that. But it's been lost to history that there was another way the women had power. They could unite for the public good by staying out of partisan politics. Not out of politics, but out of partisan politics. So 1920 came along, women got the vote. The women's clubs rather suddenly lost their power. Women, if they wanted to be involved in political issues, they joined one party or the other, but they sort of canceled each other out because they went off into the main political parties, and we no longer have that position today. There's no group that can say, oh yes, well perhaps groups of physicians in some cases can do this, but other than that, I can't think of a group that you can say, oh yes, we know that these people we can say, we know that these people are acting in the public good, not for their own interest, and so we've lost something. If you want further information, I have a website, alternativesuffrage.com, where you can find out about alternative views of women's suffrage history. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. Yes?
So you've mentioned that many women did not want the vote. What was it that shifted to allow women to eventually get the vote? Was it a change in women, or was it just enough of an onslaught of men wanting this?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And as with all these things, the answer is a little bit complicated. One thing that happened is that women, particularly in the Northeast, women who went to the Seven Sisters colleges, as they're called, Smith, Vassar, and so on, they got these modern ideas from their professors, and they spread out over the country and spread these ideas out. And I think there's something persuasive about that. Young, educated women saying, "Oh, here are these new ideas, and you might consider them." Another thing, as I said, this is a complicated subject. It's a bit of a can of worms, but I'm glad you opened it up. Another reason that people didn't want women to vote is women's main political activity during the time of the suffrage campaign, it wasn't campaigning for their own right to vote. It was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And so there was a great fear that if women got the vote, that would be the first thing they'd enact was prohibition. Now, I think most of us, knowing what we know now, if I said, would you vote for prohibition in 1915 or something, knowing what you know now, I think most of you would say no, it didn't accomplish anything. It brought great harm. It brought organized crime to America. Now, by 1917, prohibition had been enacted. And so there was no longer that fear that if women got the vote, that prohibition would come in, because it already had come in. It's hard to determine, oh, this factor was, 10% of the reason, and this factor was 3% of the reason why there was resistance. It's enormously complicated.
Thank you.
One thing I noticed is women tend to give up their rights after World War I and after World War II, where they had they had senior management in building things for the war, and then when the husbands came home, they gave that power back to them.
Yes. Yes. And when you see that in the textbooks, it's usually presented as, oh, this is another example of how women were treated badly. Sure, I get that. But at the same time, there was this big thing about men have to be breadwinners. And so the women somewhat willingly, not in every case, but they gave up these high-paying jobs. And they said, well, I'm happy to go be a homemaker, especially the baby boomer generation came out of that. And the men, they were oriented towards that. A man works, And so that's, again, a complicated subject, but thank you for raising that.